One of the world's first autofocus anamorphic lenses for APS-C cameras with a hidden gem, because it covers almost the entire full-frame sensor. Sirui 40mm T1.8 1.33x anamorphic autofocus lens. What's good guys, my name is Oleg Nikitin and you're watching All Limits On channel, and right now I'm filming with the Sony ZV-E1 full-frame camera without any clear image zoom or active stabilization, so you can see the entire image with this lens on the full-frame camera. So guys, this lens is meant to be an APS-C lens, and we'll first test it on the Sony ZV-E10 Mark II, which has the same sensor as the Sony FX30 and a6700. We can also color grade those images with the Enhancer Pro film emulation plugin and get this kind of results. I've used my gimbal, Cine Weebill 3E, and also I used this entirely with the f1.8 or T1.8, and the T-stops are the exact amount of light that comes to your sensor, whereas the f-stops is the relative number. So as you can tell guys, on the APS-C sensor we get pretty good image quality, even wide open. It's not sharp as hell wide open, but still we get good enough sharpness and a lot of background blur and separation thanks to T1.8. But what if we put it to the full frame sensor, Sony ZV-E1, and this is what we get with the full frame sensor without any additional crops. It almost entirely covers the full frame sensor, and if you add a little bit of crop like 1.1x clear image zoom, you'll get rid of the vignette completely, which is very nice. And on full frame you still get a lot of background blur and separation thanks to T1.8, as I said before. The 1.33x squeeze factor is great for Sony cameras because they use 16:9 sensors only, and you get 2:35:1 aspect ratio. The best aspect ratio is not too narrow and not too wide in my opinion. I was also using a gimbal for those shots in the park, and in my opinion the image quality does look different from a spherical lens if you simply add the black bars on the top and bottom. It does have the anamorphic characteristics, no matter the squeeze factor is only 1.33x. I think those shots turned out to be pretty cool and cinematic, and I really enjoy this soft and creamy bokeh with this lens. We'll talk about it in more detail in a few seconds, but all in all guys, I'm very satisfied with the results on the full frame sensor and on the APS-C sensor with this Sirui 40mm T1.8 autofocus lens as well. And guys, before we move on to the tests, to the optical quality, let me first tell you about the features of this lens and what comes in this really nice box. It also comes with a special pouch, a very high quality pouch, and the lens is vacuum sealed from the factory. It's a nice touch from Sirui that the dust is not coming into the lens when you purchase a new one. The lens itself is pretty big, but it's not heavy. It's 615 grams only, and for this type of an anamorphic lens, it's a lightweight lens, to be honest. We have an aperture ring which can be clicked or declicked, so both photographers and videographers would appreciate it. We also have geared focus ring and aperture ring, but the geared focus ring is not that useful for the follow focus system because it rotates indefinitely. We also have AF/MF switch and the focus hold customizable button and this 77mm filter thread, and I did purchase a step-up ring to 82mm because I always have 82mm filters. We also have the USB Type-C ports, and I did update the firmware. And all in all guys, the lens feels very premium and it feels well balanced with my Sony FX30. It's not front heavy, so a huge thumbs up for the build quality and features of this lens. Now let's have a closer look at the optical quality. And of course guys, one of the most important questions is the autofocus performance. So here we have it in the real world examples. Right now I'm tracking this guy with the pink backpack. Also right here I did tap the screen to refocus, and the speed setting was at around 4 or 5, and the focus transition was pretty fluid. And then I've tested it on my Sony FX30 with the maximum settings of speed and sensitivity for the autofocus. And as you can tell guys, when I go even backwards towards the camera, so it feels more or less doable and reliable. I didn't see any major issues. So maybe autofocus is not as fast as the prime Sony lenses, the modern Sony G Master lenses, but still it's more than doable. It's workable, if you will, and I'm really satisfied with the results for the world's first anamorphic lens. So now let's take a look at the Sony ZV-E1 with artificial intelligence module. The AF speed and sensitivity is also set to maximum, and you can see the recording of the screen, so you can understand how camera searches for my eye, for my back, how it tracks me. And all in all, I'm also more than satisfied with the results. The only issue on the full frame camera, the focus breathing is very noticeable and visible, and it more feels like the change of distortion of the corners of the shot. That is why this lens is advertised of being an APS-C lens, not a full frame lens, because you can see some different things happening in the corners, but other than that, it was great. And also guys, keep in mind that the autofocus motor is a bit loud, so let me show you, and you can also have a look at the focus breathing of the talking head shot. So in my opinion, the autofocus motor is loud, but it's okay. With the shotgun mic, you will be able to hear this, but with the lavalier mic, it's not a problem at all. And it's the first iteration. The autofocus system will be becoming better and better and better throughout the generations. And guys, for my user experience with the autofocus, I was using two techniques. The first one is being the tracking, so I tap the screen and the autofocus tracks the subject. It was doing almost flawlessly. I had minimum amount of bad shots, let me say, and also I was using it as a tap focus, so I did tap an object, then I turned the manual focus, and I kept the distance for the landscape shots, for example, and it was also looking for the focus pretty nicely and securely. It was spot on all the time. So in my opinion, it's a great iteration of autofocus for the first generational product. As for the anamorphic flares, during the daylight, it's very hard to get those, and I do prefer this type of flaring because previously Sirui did put out the 35mm f1.8 for APS-C cameras as well, 133x crop, and you see that neon sign, the on. If I were using that old lens, I would have a huge streak all across my face, but with this modern lens, I don't have it, and I much prefer this type of flaring, as I said. So during the nighttime, it's a bit easier to get the flares, but to get a very pronounced, a huge, like a thick flare, you need to point the lens straight at the source of light, and you'll get this type of flare, and I really enjoy how the flare looks. If there is a darker scene, you'll get brighter flares, of course. Here is the iPhone, and you can get some issues with autofocus because it's too bright for this scenario, and you can get some halos on the full frame cameras because this lens was meant to be an APS-C lens, but all in all, I really enjoy the flares. So we have two versions of this lens, the blue flares. Here it is on a full frame camera, and you can see a pretty nice result because it's not overwhelming, it's very subtle, and I do think that Sirui did a great job with this lens in terms of flaring, because before that it was a bit overwhelming in terms of flares, especially on the earlier generations, but right now it's much more preferable. And they also sell a neutral flare option, so if your light source is warm, it will become warm, if it's green, it will become green, if it's blue, it will be blue, etc. And right here you're watching the FX30 APS-C camera lens performance in terms of flare, and as you can tell guys, it does have some loss of contrast, but other than that, the flares are very nice and subtle. And now guys, let's talk about sharpness, vignette and distortion. As you can tell on APS-C, we have almost zero vignette in the corners, we have a very slight barrel distortion, and here is the sharpness test in the center. The T4 is the sharpest, but all in all guys, T1.8 is more than usable, and I did shoot almost the entire footage in this video at T1.8. In the corners we get the sharpest image at T4, but who needs sharp corners shooting anamorphic? I'm not sure. And here is the brightness of the corners. By T2.8 we get almost a zero vignette, as I said. And now let's test the full frame camera, and as you can tell we have a pretty weird distortion because in the middle it's a barrel distortion, but on the sides it's a pincushion distortion, and we do have some strong vignette in the corners. In the middle of the shot we can see the sharpness at T4 is great, it's the same at T5.6 and T8, but all in all guys, T1.8 and T2.2 is more than usable for sharp images. The corners are getting much brighter by T2.8 and the brightest and the sharpest by T4, and here is the chart of the vignette. The chromatic aberrations are visible, and this is the extreme scenario by the way, and if you stop down to T2.8 you get better results, and by T4 they're almost completely gone. The minimum focusing distance is 60 centimeters, which is not bad for an anamorphic lens, and on APS-C camera you get a better reproduction, of course, but all in all, even for full frame, it's a decent minimal focusing distance. In terms of sharpness, it's okay at T1.8, but you get the best micro contrast and sharpness at T4. But you can always use a very cheap and affordable diopters, and here are the diopters at +2 strength, and the full frame image on the left and the APS-C image on the right, so you can get pretty close for very cheap. And guys, let's talk about bokeh, because the bokeh is very important for anamorphic lenses, and as you can tell on full frame we can get pretty interestingly shaped bokehs, kind of hexagonal shape, let me say, and if you step down they are becoming oval shaped, but I was curious to see the hexagonal shaped bokeh because in a lot of feature films I do see weirdly shaped bokehs like hexagonal or five-cornered bokehs, etc. This is what you get at full frame on the minimal focus and distance, and in my opinion it's just beautiful. We have 11-bladed aperture and a lot of background separation. And on this shot you can see the bokehs on the full frame camera in the extreme corners, because this lens was meant to be used on APS-C cameras. The corners, the extreme corners on full frame are a bit wonky and we have kind of a squashed bokehs, but in my opinion the funkier the bokeh on the corners, the better for the anamorphic lens if you want to use it for feature films or some shots like a dreamy shot or something else. So here is the bokeh itself from T1.8 to T8, and as you can tell when we step down to T2, T2.2, we get rounder bokehs, more oval-shaped bokehs, more classic bokehs if you will, and here is a closer shot. The quality of the bokehs themselves is great. We have a little bit of chromatic aberrations and inner kind of onion ringing, but it's nothing too crazy. I've seen much worse results, and we do retain pretty circular or oval shape even at T8. Here is the full frame coverage, and as you can tell in the extreme corners we have some squashed bokehs, but I do prefer those because I love funky bokehs on anamorphic lenses. And here we have the APS-C coverage, and the bokehs in the corners are much more classic, let me say, not that weirdly shaped, and the overall bokeh quality of this lens is really making me happy. And guys, remember I was talking about the manual focus 35mm f1.8 1.33x Sirui lens, which was released in 2020 or 2021 I guess. And just imagine guys, that lens, the manual focus one, was exactly the same in terms of the startup price, around $800 4 to 5 years ago. And right now we have this one, the autofocus version. And let me tell you the benefits of this one compared to that one that changed in 4 years. So this one has autofocus. A huge change, by the way. Also, this one has a constant squeeze factor. The thing is that the previous versions, they had the changeable, not constant squeeze ratio, and you had 1.33x squeeze ratio at the infinity, but if you were using it at the minimal focusing distance, it was more like 1.25x, and you had to manually readjust the squeeze factor in post to make objects and faces look proper. Also guys, this lens has more subtle flares, and they are totally different, and I do prefer more subtle flares all day, all night. Also guys, this new one has a neutral flare option, and I would rather prefer the neutral flares, and I highly recommend you picking the neutral flare option. The minimum focusing distance is now 60 centimeters versus 85 centimeters, a nice touch. Also, we have a lighter and more compact lens, because this one is 615 grams and that one is 700 grams. We also have a bigger full frame sensor coverage, so with this autofocus lens we only need to go 1.1x clear image zoom, whereas with that one we had to go 1.3 times clear image zoom, so 30% versus 10% of full frame coverage with the additional crop. With the new autofocus lens we also have a lot more lens control elements, like the customizable button, we can click or declick the aperture ring, and all in all this lens is much more modern and versatile. And the only advantage of the old manual focus anamorphic lens was that it had the micro four thirds mount, and you could screw on a little ring and adapter for the Sony E, so you could use it in both micro four thirds and Sony E mount. That's it. And guys, finally the price. It's around $800 or 900 euros depending on where you purchase this lens, and in my opinion is just a bargain, because most of the Sirui lenses, anamorphic lenses like the Saturn lineup or the Venus lineup, the manual focus lenses, they're definitely great, but they are also around this price range. And if you are just starting out in anamorphic filmmaking, if you want to try it at least, if you want to use it for solo creators or on an indie project, I think the autofocus version would be a much more preferable option. And the coolest thing about this lens is that it has the best of both worlds. We have the full frame mode with funky corners, distortion, crazy bokeh on the side, etc. And we have a very clean with minimal distortion, with minimal vignetting, and with very versatile focal length APS-C version of this lens. And I think, guys, that it's the best lens that Sirui put out throughout their entire lens manufacturing career. So what do you think? Please let me know down in the comment section below. If you have any questions, also drop them down in the comment section. If you did enjoy this video, please smash the like and subscribe buttons and hit the notifications bell. And right here I have a full review of 10 Sirui anamorphic manual focus lenses for you to watch next. here, guys. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.